Hello and welcome back. This is the sixth story from the book Tales from the Dead of Night. The 6 of 13. Pardon my voice. I'm not been feeling too great over the past week for varying reasons. The author is most unlikely for haunted ghost stories, and that's Ruth Rendell, who lived from 1930 to 2015, though when this book was produced she was still alive. Ruth Rendell was born in London of Swedish and English descent. Her elegant crime fiction and thrillers, which focus on the psychological complexities behind seemingly ordinary lives, have been praised by authors from Toni Morrison to Ian Rankin. She has also edited the ghost stories of M.R. James, whom she described as, quote, the best of all ghost story writers. During an early job at the Chigwell Times, she reported on a house supposedly haunted by the ghost of an old woman. The owners threatened the newspaper with litigation for devaluing their home. She was made a life peer, Baroness Rendell of Bayborough, in 1997, and sat in the House of Lords for Labour. And this story, The Haunting of Shawley Rectory, was first published in Ellery Queen's Mystery magazine 50 years ago in 1972. And I will read you this this story. I think it's about 22 pages long, so it's one of the longer ones of the book, but not the longest. So, The Haunting of Shawley Rectory by Ruth Rendell. I don't believe in the supernatural, but just the same I wouldn't live in Shawley Rectory. That was what I had been thinking, and what Gordon Scott said to me when we heard we were to have a new rector at St. Mary's. Our wives gave us quizzical looks. Not very logical, said Eleanor, my wife. What I mean is, said Gordon, that however certain you might be that ghosts don't exist, if you lived in a place that was reputedly haunted, you wouldn't be able to help wondering every time you heard a stair creak. All the normal sounds of an old house would take on a different significance. I agreed with him. It wouldn't be very pleasant feeling uneasy every time one was alone in one's own home at night. Personally, said Patsy Scott, I've always believed there are no ghosts in the rectory that a good central heating system wouldn't get rid of. We laughed at that, but Eleanor said, you can't just dismiss it like that. The Cobworths heard and felt things, even if they didn't actually see anything. And so did the Bucklands before them. And you won't find anyone more level-headed than Kate Cobworth. Patsy shrugged. The Loys didn't even hear or feel anything. They've heard the stories. They expected to hear the footsteps and the carriage wheels. Diana Loy told me. And Diana was quite a nervy, highly strung sort of person. But absolutely nothing happened while they were there. Well, maybe the Church of England, or whoever's responsible, will install central heating for this new person, I said, and we'll see if your theory's right, Patsy. Eleanor and I went home after that. We went on foot because our house is only about a quarter of a mile up Shawley Lane. On the way we stopped in front of the rectory, which is about 100 yards long. We stood and looked over the gate. I may as well describe the rectory to you before I get on with this story. The date of it is around 1760, and it's built of pale, dun-coloured brick with plain, classical windows and a front door in the middle with a pediment over it. It's a big house with 3 reception rooms, 6 bedrooms, 2 kitchens and 2 staircases, and 1 poky little bathroom made by having converted a linen closet. The house is a bit stark to look at, a bit forbidding. It seems to stare straight back at you, but the trees round it are pretty enough, and so are the stables on the left-hand side with a clock in their gable and a weather vane on top. Tom Cobworth, the last rector, kept his old Morris in there. The garden is huge, a wilderness that no one could keep tidy these days, 8 acres of it, including the glebe. It was years since I had been inside the rectory. I remember wondering if the interior was as shabby and in need of paint as the outside. The windows had that black, blank, hazy look of windows at which no curtains hang, and which no one has cleaned for months or even years. "Who exactly does it belong to?" said Eleanor. "Lazarus College, Oxford," I said. Tom was a fellow of Lazarus. "And what about this new man?" "I don't know," I said. "I think all that system of livings has changed, but I'm pretty vague about it. I'm not a churchgoer, not religious at all, really. Perhaps that was why I hadn't got to know the Cobworths all that well. I used to feel a bit uneasy in Tom's company. I used to have the feeling he might suddenly round on me and demand to know why he never saw me in church." Eleanor had no such inhibitions with Kate. They were friends, close friends, and Eleanor missed her after Tom died suddenly of a heart attack and she had had to leave the rectory. She'd gone back to her people up north, taking her 15-year-old daughter Louise with her. Kate is a practical, down-to-earth Yorkshire woman. She had been a nurse, a ward sister, I believe, before her marriage. When Tom got the living of Shawley, she several times met Mrs. Buckland, the wife of the retiring incumbent, and from her learned to expect what Mrs. Buckland called manifestations. "I couldn't believe she was actually saying it," Kate had said to Eleanor. "I thought I was dreaming, and then I thought she was mad. I mean, really psychotic, mentally ill." "Ghosts, I ask you. People believe in things like that in this day and age. And then we moved in and I heard them too. The crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive when there was no carriage or any kind of vehicle to be seen. Doors closing softly when no doors had been left open. Footsteps crossing the landing and going downstairs, crossing the hall, then the front door opening softly and closing softly." "But how could you bear it?" Eleanor said. "Weren't you afraid? Weren't you terrified?" "We got used to it. We had to, you see. It wasn't as if we could sell the house and buy another. Besides, I love Shawley. I loved it from the first moment I set foot in the village. After the harshness of the north, Dorset is so gentle and mild and pretty. The doors closing and the footsteps and the wheels on the drive, they didn't do us any harm. And we had each other. We weren't alone. You can get used to anything. To ghosts as much as to damp and woodworm and dry rot. There's all that in the rectory too, and I found it much more trying." The Bucklands, apparently, had got used to it too. 30 years he had been rector of the parish. 30 years they had lived there with the wheels and the footsteps, and had brought up their son and daughter there. No harm had come to them. They slept soundly, and their grown-up children used to joke about their haunted house. "Nobody ever seems to see anything," I said to Eleanor as we walked home. "And no one ever comes up with a story, a sort of background to all this walking about and banging and crunching. Is there supposed to be a murder there or some sort of violent death?" She said she didn't know. Kate had never said. The sound of the wheels, the closing of the doors, always took place at about 9 in the evening, followed by the footsteps and the opening and closing of the front door. After that there was silence, and it hadn't happened every evening by any means. The only other thing was that Kate had never cared to use the big drawing room in the evenings. She and Tom and Louise had always stayed in the dining room or the morning room. They did use the drawing room in the daytime. It was just that in the evenings the room felt strange to her, chilly even in summer and indefinably hostile. Once she had had to go in there at 10:30. She needed her reading glasses, which she had left in the drawing room during the afternoon. She ran into the room and ran out again. She hadn't looked about her, just rushed in, keeping her eyes fixed on the eyeglass case on the mantelpiece. The icy hostility in that room had really frightened her, and that had been the only time she had felt dislike and fear of Shawley Rectory. Of course, one doesn't have to find explanations for an icy hostility. It's much more easily understood as being the product of tension and fear than oral phenomena are. I didn't have much faith in Kate's feelings about the drawing room. I thought with a kind of admiration of Jack and Diana Loy, that elderly couple who had rented the Rectory for a year after Kate's departure, had been primed with stories of hauntings by Kate, yet had neither heard nor felt a thing. As far as I know, they had used that drawing room constantly. Often, when I had passed the gate in their time, I had seen lights in the drawing room windows at 9 and 10:30 and even at midnight. The Loys had been gone 3 months. When Lazarus had first offered the Rectory for rent, the idea had been that Shawley should do without a clergyman of its own. I think this must have been the church economising, nothing to do certainly with ghosts. The services at St. Mary's were to be undertaken by the vicar of the next parish, Mr. Hartley. Whether he found this too much for him in conjunction with the duties of his own parish, or whether the powers that be in affairs Anglican had second thoughts, I can't say. But on the departure of the Loys, it was decided there should be an incumbent to replace Tom. The first hint of this we had from local gossip. Next, the facts appeared in our monthly news sheet, the Shawley Post. Couched in its customary parish magazine journalese, it said, "Shawley residents all extend a hearty welcome to their new rector, the Reverend Stephen Galton, whose coming to the parish with his charming wife will fill a long-felt need." "He's very young," said Eleanor, a few days after our discussion of haunting with the Scots. "Under 30. "That won't bother me," I said. "I don't intend to be preached at by him. Anyway, why not? Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings," I said. "Hast thou ordained strength?" "Hark at the devil quoting scripture," said Eleanor. "They say his wife's only 23. I thought she must have met them. She knew so much, but no. It's just what's being said. Patsy got it from Judy Lawrence. Judy said they're moving in next month and her mother's coming with them." "Who, Judy's?" I said. "Don't be silly," said my wife. "Mrs. Galton's mother, the rector's mother-in-law. She's coming to live with them." Move in they did, and out again 2 days later. The first we knew that something had gone very wrong for the Galtons was when I was out for my usual evening walk with our Irish setter, Liam. We were coming back past the cottage that belongs to Charlie Lawrence, who is by way of being Shawley's squire, and which he keeps for the occupation of his gardener, when he is lucky enough to have a gardener. At that time, last June, he hadn't had a gardener for at least 6 months, and the cottage should have been empty. As I approached, however, I saw a woman's face, young, fair, very pretty, at one of the upstairs windows. I rounded the hedge and Liam began an insane barking, for just inside the cottage gate, on the drive, peering in under the hood of an aged Wolsey, was a tall young man, wearing a tweed sports jacket over one of those black top things the clergy wear, and a clerical collar. "Good evening," I said. "Shut up, Liam, will you?" "Good evening," he said in a quiet, abstracted sort of way. I told Eleanor. She couldn't account for the Galtons occupying Charlie Lawrence's gardener's cottage instead of Shawley Rectory, their proper abode, but Patsy Scott could. She came round on the following morning with a punnet of strawberries for us. The Scots grow the best strawberries for miles around. "They've been driven out by the ghosts," she said. "Can you credit it? A clergyman of the Church of England, an educated man. They were in that place not 48 hours before they were screaming to Charlie Lawrence to find them somewhere else to go. I asked her if she was sure it wasn't just the damp and the dry rot. Look, you know me. I don't believe the Rectory's haunted, or anywhere can be haunted, come to that. I'm telling you what Mrs. Galton told me. She came to us on Thursday morning and said, did I think there was anyone in Shawley had a house or a cottage to rent because they couldn't stick the Rectory another night? I asked her what was wrong, and she said she knew it sounded crazy. It did too, she was right there. She knew it sounded mad, but they'd been terrified out of their lives by what they'd heard and seen since they moved in. Seen? I said. She actually claims to have seen something. She said her mother did. She said her mother saw something in the drawing room the first evening they were there. They'd already heard the carriage wheels and the doors closing and the footsteps and all that. The second evening no one dared go in the drawing room. They heard all the sounds again, and Mrs. Granger, that's the mother, heard voices in the drawing room. And it was then that they decided they couldn't stand it, that they'd have to get out. I don't believe it, I said. I don't believe any of it. The woman's a psychopath. She's playing some sort of ghastly joke. Just as Kate was, and the Bucklands, said Eleanor quietly. Patsy ignored her and turned to me. I feel just like you. It's awful, but what can you do? These stories grow, and they sort of infect people, and the more suggestible the people are, the worse the infection. Charlie and Judy are furious. They don't want it getting in the paper that Shawley Rectory is haunted. Think of all the people we shall get coming in cars on Sundays and gawping over the gates. But they had to let them have the cottage in common humanity. Mrs. Granger was hysterical, and poor little Mrs. Galton wasn't much better. Who told them to expect all those horrors? That's what I'd like to know. What does Gordon say? I said. He's keeping an open mind, but he says he'd like to spend an evening there. In spite of the Lawrences' fury, the haunting of Shawley Rectory did get quite a lot of publicity. There was a sensational story about it in one of the popular Sundays, and then Stephen Galton's mother-in-law went on television. Western TV interviewed her on a local news programme. I hadn't ever seen Mrs. Granger in the flesh, and her youthful appearance rather surprised me. She looked no more than 35, though she must be into her 40s. The interviewer asked if she had ever heard any stories of ghosts at Shawley Rectory before she went there, and she said she hadn't. Did she believe in ghosts? Now she did. What had happened? Asked the interviewer after they had moved in. It had started at 9 o'clock, she said. At 9 on their first evening. She and her daughter were sitting in the bigger of the two kitchens having a cup of coffee. They had been moving in all day, unpacking, putting things away. They heard 2 doors close upstairs, then footsteps coming down the main staircase. She had thought it was her son-in-law, except that it couldn't have been, because as the footsteps died away, he came in through the door from the back kitchen. They couldn't understand what it had been, but they weren't frightened. Not then. We were planning on going to bed early, said Mrs. Granger. She was very articulate, very much at ease in front of the cameras. Just about 10:30 I had to go into the big room they call the drawing room. The removal men had put some of our boxes in there, and my radio was in one of them. I wanted to listen to my radio in bed. I opened the drawing room door and put my hand to the light switch. I didn't put the light on. The moon was quite bright that night, and it was shining into the room. There were people, 2 figures. I don't know what to call them, between the windows. One of them, the girl, was lying huddled on the floor. The other figure, an older woman, was bending over her. She stood up when I opened the door and looked at me. I knew I wasn't seeing real people. I don't know how, but I knew that. I remember I couldn't move my hand to switch the light on. I was frozen, just staring at that pale, tragic face while it stared back at me. I did manage at last to back out and close the door, and I got back to my daughter and my son-in-law in the kitchen, and I collapsed. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. Yet you stayed a night and a day, And another night in the Rectory, said the interviewer. Yes, well, her daughter and her son-in-law had persuaded her it had been some sort of hallucination, the consequence of being overtired. Not that she had ever really believed that. The night had been quiet, and so had the next day until 9 in the evening, when they were all this time in the morning room, and they heard a car drive up to the front room door. They had all heard it, wheels crunching on the gravel, the sound of the engine, the brakes going on. Then had followed the closing of the doors upstairs and the footsteps, the opening and closing of the front door. Yes, they had been very frightened, or she and her daughter had. Her son-in-law had made a thorough search of the whole house, but found nothing, seen or heard no one. At 10:30 they had all gone into the hall and listened outside the drawing-room door, and she and her daughter had heard voices from inside the room, women's voices. Stephen had wanted to go in, but they had stopped him, and they had been so frightened. Now the interesting thing was that there had been something in the Sunday Express account about the Rectory being haunted by the ghosts of 2 women. The story quoted someone it described as a local antiquarian, a man named Joseph Lamb, whom I had heard of but never met. Lamb told the Express there was an old tradition that the ghosts were of a mother and daughter, and that the mother had killed the daughter in the drawing-room. I never heard any of that before, I said to Gordon Scott, and I'm sure Cape Cobworth hadn't. Who is this Joseph Lamb? He's a nice chap, said Gordon, and he's supposed to know more of local history than anyone else around. I'll ask him over and you can come and meet him if you like. That is Joseph, isn't it? I'm just checking. Yes. Joseph Lamb, because it's down here as Josper. Joseph Lamb lives in a rather fine Jacobean house in a hamlet. You could hardly call it a village. About a mile to the north of Shawley. I had often admired it without knowing who had lived there. The Scotts asked him and his wife to dinner shortly after. Mrs. Granger's appearance on television, and after dinner we got him on to the subject of the hauntings. Lamb wasn't at all unwilling to enlighten us. He's a man of about 60, and he said he first heard the story of the 2 women from his nurse when he was a little boy. Not a very suitable subject with which to regale a 7-year-old, he said. These 2 are supposed to have lived at the Rectory at one time, he said. The story is that the mother had a lover, or a man friend, or whatever, and the daughter took him away from her. When the daughter confessed it, the mother killed her in a jealous rage. It was Eleanor who objected to this. But surely if they lived in the Rectory, they must have been the wife and daughter of a rector. I don't really see how in those circumstances the mother could have had a lover or the daughter could steal him away. No, it doesn't much sound like what we've come to think of as the domestic life of the English country parson, does it? Said Lamb. And the strange thing is, although my nanny used to swear by the story, and I heard it later from someone who worked at the Rectory, I haven't been able to find any trace of these women in the Rectory's history. It's not hard to research, you see, because only the rectors of Shawley had ever lived there until the Loys rented it. And the rectors' names are all up on that plaque in the church from 1380 onwards. There was another house on the site before this present one, of course, and parts of the older building are incorporated in the newer. My nanny used to say that the elder lady hadn't got a husband. He had presumably died. She was supposed to be 40 years old and the girl 19. Well, I tracked back through the families of the various rectors, and I found a good many cases where the rectors had predeceased their wives, but none of them fitted my nanny's story. They were either too old, one was much too young, or their daughters were too old, or they had no daughters. It's a pity Mrs. Granger didn't tell us what kind of clothes her ghosts were wearing, said Patsy with sarcasm. You could have pinpointed the date then, couldn't you? You mean that if the lady had had a steeple hat on, she'd be medieval, or around 1850 if she was wearing a crinoline? "Something like that," said Patsy. At this point, Gordon repeated his wish to spend an evening in the Rectory. "I think I'll write to the Master of Lazarus and ask permission," he said. Very soon after, we heard that the Rectory was to be sold. Notice boards appeared by the front gate and at the corner where the glebe abutted Shawley Lane, announcing that the house would go up for auction on 30th of October. Patsy, who always seems to know everything, told us that a reserve price of £60,000 had been put on it. "Not as much as I'd have expected," she said. "It must be the ghosts keeping the price down." "Whoever buys it will have to spend another 10,000 on it," said Eleanor, "and central heating will be a priority." Whatever was keeping the price down, ghosts, cold or dry rot, there were plenty of people anxious to view the house and land with, I supposed, an idea of buying it. I could hardly be at work in my garden or out with Liam without a car stopping and the driver asking me the way to the Rectory. Gordon and Patsy got quite irritated about what they described as crowds milling about in the lane and trippers everywhere waving orders to view. The estate agents handling the sale were a firm called Curlew, Pond and Co. Gordon didn't bother with the Master of Lazarus, but managed to get the key from Graham Curlew, whom he knew quite well, and permission to spend an evening in the Rectory. Curlew didn't like the idea of anyone staying the night, but Gordon didn't want to do that anyway. No one had ever heard or seen anything after 10:30. He asked me if I'd go with him. Patsy wouldn't. She thought it was all too adolescent and stupid. "Of course I will," I said, "as long as you'll agree to our taking some sort of heating arrangement with us, and brandy in case of need." By then it was the beginning of October and the evenings were turning cool. The day on which we decided to have our vigil happened also to be the one on which Stephen Galton and his wife moved out of Charlie Lawrence's cottage and left Shawley for good. According to the Shawley Post, he had gone a living in Manchester. Mrs. Granger had gone back to her own home in London, from where she had written an article about the Rectory for Psychic News. Patsy shrieked with laughter to see the two of us setting forth with our oil stove, a dozen candles, 2 torches, and half a bottle of Courvoisier. She did well to laugh. Her amusement wasn't misplaced. We crossed the lane and opened the Rectory gate and went up the gravel drive on which those spirit wheels had so often been heard to crunch. It was 7 o'clock in the evening and still light. The day had been fine and the sky was red with the aftermath of a spectacular sunset. I unlocked the front door and in we went. The first thing I did was put a match to one of the candles because it wasn't at all light inside. We walked down the passage to the kitchens, I carrying the candle and Gordon shining one of the torches across the walls. The place was a mess. I suppose it hadn't had anything done to it, not even a cleaning, since the Lloyds moved out. It smelled damp and there was even fungus growing in patches on the kitchen walls, and it was extremely cold. There was a kind of deathly chill in the air, far more of a chill than one would have expected on a warm day in October. That kitchen had the feel you get when you open the door of a refrigerator that hasn't been kept too clean and is in need of defrosting. We put our stuff down on a kitchen table someone had left behind and made our way up the back stairs. All the bedroom doors were open and we closed them. The upstairs had a neglected, dreary feel, but it was less cold. We went down the main staircase, a rather fine curving affair with elegant banisters and carved newel posts, and entered the drawing room. It was empty, palely lit by the evening light from 2 windows. On the mantelpiece was a glass jar with greenish water in it, a half-burnt candle in a saucer, and a screwed-up paper table napkin. We had decided not to remain in this room, but to open the door and look in at 10:30. So accordingly we returned to the kitchen, fetched out candles and torches and brandy, and settled down in the morning room, which was at the front of the house on the other side of the front door. Curlew had told Gordon there were a couple of deck chairs in this room. We found them resting against the wall and we put them up. We lit our oil stove and a second candle, and we set one candle on the windowsill and one on the floor between us. It was still and silent and cold. The dark closed in fairly rapidly, the red fading from the sky, which became a deep blue, then indigo. We sat and talked. It was about the haunting that we talked, collating the various pieces of evidence, assessing the times this or that was supposed to happen, and making sure we both knew the sequence in which things happened. We were both wearing watches, and I remembered that we constantly checked the time. At 8:30 we again opened the drawing-room door and looked inside. The moon had come up and was shining through the windows as it had shone for Mrs. Granger. Gordon went upstairs with a torch and checked that all the doors remained closed, and then we both looked into the other large downstairs room, the dining room, I suppose. Here a fan light in one of the windows was open. That accounted for some of the feeling of cold and damp, Gordon said. The window must have been opened by some prospective buyer viewing the place. We closed it and went back into the morning room to wait. The silence was absolute. We didn't talk any more. We waited, watching the candles and the glow of the stove, which had taken some of the chill from the air. Outside it was pitch dark. The hands of our watches slowly approached 9. At 9:03 we heard the noise. Not wheels or doors closing or a tread on the stairs, but a faint, dainty pattering sound. It was very faint. It was very distant. It was on the ground floor. It was as if made by something less than human, lighter than that, tiptoeing. I had never thought about this moment beyond telling myself that if anything did happen, if there was a manifestation, it would be enormously interesting. It had never occurred to me even once that I should be so dreadfully, so hideously afraid. I didn't look at Gordon. I couldn't move either. The pattering feet were less faint now, were coming closer. I felt myself grow white, the blood all drawn in from the surface of my skin, as I was gripped by that awful primitive terror that has nothing to do with reason or with knowing what you believe in and what you don't. Gordon got to his feet and stood there looking at the door, and then I couldn't stand it any more. I jumped up and threw open the door, holding the candle aloft, and looked into a pair of brilliant golden green eyes, staring steadily back at me about a foot from the ground. "My God," said Gordon. "My God, it's Lawrence's cat. It must have gone in through the window." He bent down and picked up the cat, a soft, stout, marmalade-coloured creature. I felt sick at the anticlimax. The time was exactly 9 o'clock. With the cat draped over his arm, Gordon went back into the morning room, and I followed him. We didn't sit down. We stood waiting for the wheels and the closing of the doors. Nothing happened. I have no business to keep you in suspense any longer, for the fact is that after the business with the cat, nothing happened at all. At 9:15 we sat down in our deck chairs. The cat lay on the floor beside the oil stove and went to sleep. Twice we heard a car pass along Shawley Lane, a remotely distant sound, but we heard nothing else. "Feel like a spot of brandy?" said Gordon. "Why not?" I said. So we each had a nip of brandy, and at 10 we had another look in the drawing-room. By then we were both feeling bored and quite sure that since nothing had happened at 9, nothing would happen at 10:30 either. Of course, we stayed till 10:30 and for half an hour after that, and then we decamped. We put the cat over the wall into Lawrence's grounds and went back to Gordon's house, where Patsy awaited us, smiling cynically. I had had quite enough of the Rectory, but that wasn't true of Gordon. He said it was well known that the phenomena didn't take place every night. We had simply struck an off night, and he was going back on his own. He did too, half a dozen times between then and the 30th, even going so far as to have, rather unethically, a key cut from the one curlew had lent him. Patsy would never go with him, though he tried hard to persuade her. But in all those visits he never saw or heard anything, and the effect on him was to make him as great a sceptic as Patsy. "I've got a good mind to make an offer for the Rectory myself," he said. "It's a fine house, and I've got quite attached to it." "You're not serious," I said. "I'm perfectly serious. I'll go to the auction with a view for buying it if I can get Patsy to agree. But Patsy preferred her own house, and very reluctantly Gordon had to give up the idea. The Rectory was sold for £62,000 to an American woman, a friend of Judy Lawrence. About a month after the sale, the builders moved in. Eleanor used to get progress reports from Patsy, how they had rewired and treated the whole place for woodworm, and painted and relayed floors. The central heating engineers came too, much to Patsy's satisfaction. We met Carol Marcus, the Rectory's new owner, when we were asked round to the hall for drinks one Sunday morning. She was staying there with the Lawrences until such time as the improvements and decorations to the Rectory were complete. We were introduced by Judy to a very pretty, well-dressed woman in young middle age. I asked her when she expected to move in. April, she hoped, as soon as the builders had finished the 2 extra bathrooms. She had heard rumours that the Rectory was supposed to be haunted, and these had amused her very much. A haunted house in the English countryside. It was too good to be true. It's all nonsense, you know, said Gordon, who had joined us. It's all purely imaginary. And he went on to tell her of his own experiences in the house during October, or his non-experiences, I should say. Well, for goodness sake, I didn't believe it, she said, and she laughed and went on to say how much she loved the house and wanted to make it a real home for her children to come to. She had 3, she said, all in their teens, 2 boys away at school and a girl a bit older. That was the only time I ever talked to her, and I remember thinking she would be a welcome addition to the neighbourhood. A nice woman. Serene is the word that best described her. There was a man friend of hers there too. I didn't catch his surname, but she called him Guy. He was staying at one of the locals to be near her, presumably. I should think those 2 would get married, wouldn't you? Said Eleanor on the way home. Judy told me she's waiting to get her divorce. Later that day I took Liam for a walk along Shawley Lane, and when I came to the Rectory I found the gate open. So I walked up the gravel drive and looked through the drawing-room window at the new wood-block floor and ivory-painted windows, walls and radiators. The place was swiftly being transformed. It was no longer sinister or grim. I walked round the back and peered in at the splendidly fitted kitchens, one a laundry now, and wondered what on earth had made sensible women like Mrs. Buckland and Kate spread such vulgar tales and the Galdens panic. What had come over them? I could only imagine that they felt a need to direct attention to themselves, which they perhaps could do in no other way. I whistled for Liam and strolled down to the gate and looked back at the Rectory. It stared back at me. Is it hindsight that makes me say this, or did I really feel it then? I think I did feel it, that the house stared at me with a kind of steady insolence. Carol Marcus moved in 3 weeks ago on a sunny day in the middle of April. 2 nights later, just before 11, there came a sustained ringing at Gordon's door as if someone were leaning on the bell. Gordon went to the door. Carol Marcus stood outside, absolutely calm but deathly white. She said to him, "May I use your phone, please? Mine isn't in yet, and I have to call the police. I just shot my daughter." She took a step forward and crumpled in a heap on the threshold. Gordon picked her up and carried her into the house, and Patsy gave her brandy, and then he went across the road to the Rectory. There were lights on all over the house. The front door was open, and light was streaming out onto the drive and the little Citroën Diane that was parked there. He walked into the house. The drawing-room door was open, and he walked in there and saw a young girl lying on the carpet between the windows. She was dead. There was blood from a bullet wound on the front of the dress, and on a low round table lay the small automatic that Carol Marcus had used. In the meantime, Patsy had been the unwilling listener to a confession. Carol Marcus told her that the girl, who was 19, had unexpectedly driven down from London, arriving at the Rectory at 9 o'clock. She had had a drink and something to eat, and when she had something to tell her mother, that was why she had come down. While in London, she was seeing a lot of the man called Guy, and now they found that they were in love with each other. She knew it would hurt her mother, but she wanted to tell her at once. She wanted to be honest about it. Carol Marcus told Patsy she felt nothing. No shock, no hatred or resentment, no jealousy. It was as if she were impelled by some external force to do what she did. Take the gun she always kept with her from a drawer in the writing desk and kill her daughter. At this point, Gordon came back and they phoned the police. Within a quarter of an hour, the police were at the house. They arrested Carol Marcus and took her away, and she is on remand, awaiting trial on a charge of murder. So what is the explanation of all this? Or does there, in fact, have to be an explanation? Eleanor and I were so shocked by what had happened, and awed too, that for a while we were somehow wary of talking about it even to each other. Then Eleanor said, "It's as if all this time the coming event cast its shadow before it." I nodded, yet it didn't seem quite that to me. It was more that the Rectory was waiting for the right people to come along, the people who would fit its still unplayed scenario. The woman of 40, the daughter of 19, the lover. And only to those who approximated these characters could it show shadows and whispers of the drama. The closer the approximation, the clearer the sounds and signs. The Loys were old and childless, so they saw nothing. Nor did Gordon and I. We were of the wrong sex. But the Bucklins, who had a daughter, heard and felt things. And so did Kate, though she was too old for the tragic leading role, and her adolescent girl too young for victim. The Galtons had been nearly right. Had Mrs. Granger once hoped the young rector would marry her before she showed his preference for her daughter? But the women had been a few years too senior for the parts. Even so, they had come closer to participation than those before them. All this is very fanciful, and I haven't mentioned a word of it to Gordon and Patsy. They wouldn't listen if I did. They persist in seeing the events of 3 weeks ago as no more than a sordid murder, a crime of jealousy committed by someone whose mind was disturbed. But I haven't been able to keep from asking myself, what would have happened if Gordon had bought the Rectory when he talked of doing so? Patsy will be 40 this year. I don't think I've mentioned that she has a daughter by her first marriage who is away at the university and going on 19 now. A girl that they say is extravagantly fond of Gordon. He is talking once more of buying, since Carol Marcus, whatever may become of her, will hardly keep the place now. The play is played out, but need that mean there will never be a repeat performance?